The moment arrived quietly, disguised as an ordinary question during what was supposed to be a comforting Thanksgiving meal. The apartment was filled with familiar holiday scents, roasted turkey and warm spices drifting through the air, attempting to create a sense of normalcy that had been missing for years. Plates moved from hand to hand, polite smiles appeared on cue, and conversations stayed safely shallow, as if everyone at the table understood that deeper truths were better left untouched. Yet beneath that fragile calm, tension lingered, shaped by years of unspoken sacrifices and silent endurance. For 3 years, life had been defined by survival rather than reflection. Working long hours, often back-to-back, had become routine, not out of ambition, but necessity. Every shift, every paycheck, every transfer was made with the belief that stability depended on relentless effort. Rent was paid faithfully and without question, even when exhaustion set in and sleep became a luxury rather than a guarantee. The idea of home was tied not to comfort, but to obligation, responsibility, and the fear of losing the only remaining sense of security after profound loss. Thanksgiving, meant to represent togetherness and gratitude, instead highlighted how fragile that sense of security truly was. When the question was asked, simple, direct, and unexpected, it cut through the room with astonishing force. It wasn't accusatory or loud, but its weight was undeniable. Why pay rent for something that already belonged to you? In that instant, time seemed to fracture. The warmth of the room evaporated, replaced by confusion and a creeping realization that something fundamental had been wrong all along. Shock settled in first, followed by disbelief. The question challenged years of accepted reality, unraveling assumptions that had been built during grief and reinforced through trust. Every sacrifice, every skipped meal, every exhausting shift suddenly stood under harsh light, demanding explanation. The silence that followed was suffocating, filled with the sound of unasked questions finally demanding answers. The betrayal was not loud or dramatic in its reveal, but quiet and devastating in its implications. What made the moment unbearable was not just the financial deception, but the emotional manipulation hidden beneath it. Trust had been offered freely during the most vulnerable period of life, when loss blurred judgment and family felt like the last remaining anchor. That trust was used to shape a narrative that kept one person carrying the full burden, while another lived without consequences. The realization didn't arrive all at once. It spread slowly, like a crack widening through glass, threatening to shatter everything it touched. The Thanksgiving table became a symbol of that betrayal. What should have been a space for comfort turned into a stage where truth could no longer be avoided. The question exposed how easily love and loyalty can be twisted when one person assumes responsibility without verification, believing sacrifice equals strength. It revealed how silence, when maintained long enough, can become a powerful tool of control. As the truth settled, anger mixed with grief, but so did clarity. The moment forced an awakening that had been delayed by exhaustion and emotional survival. It became impossible to ignore the imbalance any longer, impossible to justify the pain as temporary or necessary. The question did what years of struggle could not. It stopped the cycle. That Thanksgiving marked the end of blind trust and the beginning of reclaiming autonomy. The betrayal, once hidden beneath routine and obligation, stood fully exposed, leaving no room for denial. Though painful, the moment carried an unexpected gift: awareness. From that single question came the understanding that self-worth is not proven through suffering, and family loyalty does not require silence in the face of injustice. The table was cleared, the meal ended, but the truth remained, irreversible and transformative, changing the course of everything that followed.
For years, the idea of home was tangled with stress, obligation, and a constant undercurrent of fear. Paying rent each month felt like the price of survival, a non-negotiable responsibility that dictated every choice and every sacrifice. The money left my account with mechanical regularity, always on time, always complete, reinforcing the belief that stability depended entirely on my ability to keep working, no matter how exhausted I became. I never questioned why the burden rested solely on me. I only knew that failing to pay meant losing the one place that felt like an anchor after everything else had fallen apart. The apartment itself never felt fully mine, even though I lived there day and night. It was a space shaped around compromise and restraint, where decisions were filtered through the idea that I was merely maintaining something temporary. I avoided investing emotionally in it, telling myself that renters don't get attached. Walls remained bare longer than they should have, furniture stayed mismatched, and improvements were postponed for a future that always felt just out of reach. The place functioned more like a shelter than a sanctuary, something to be preserved rather than enjoyed. Every dollar cent carried invisible weight. Paying rent meant skipping rest, declining invitations, and measuring life in hours worked instead of moments lived. I learned to calculate expenses with precision, balancing food, utilities, and transportation against income scraped together from overlapping shifts. There was no margin for error. The pressure never eased because the belief that the apartment could be taken away at any moment kept me locked in a cycle of constant vigilance. Home ownership was an abstract concept reserved for people with stability, not someone still clawing back from loss. What made the truth so devastating was how completely it upturned that internal narrative. Discovering that the apartment had belonged to me all along didn't just change a legal fact, it rewrote years of emotional experience. The rent payments were no longer evidence of responsibility, but proof of manipulation hidden behind familiarity and trust. The exhaustion I wore like a badge of honor suddenly looked like something that had been quietly extracted rather than freely chosen. The realization forced me to confront how grief had shaped my decisions. In the aftermath of losing everything that mattered, I clung to structure wherever it appeared. Paying rent felt like control in a world that had offered very little of it. I mistook obligation for purpose and endurance for strength. I believed that carrying more weight meant I was doing something right, that my struggle was necessary to keep the fragile remains of family intact. Learning the apartment was mine revealed how easily self-sacrifice can be exploited when boundaries dissolve. The money I worked relentlessly to earn had been cycling back into a system that benefited someone else's comfort while reinforcing my own limitations. Yet the deeper cost wasn't financial. It was the years spent believing I had to earn the right to exist in a space that already belonged to me. Years spent shrinking my needs to preserve a version of peace that wasn't real. The concept of rent transformed overnight. It was no longer a monthly obligation, but a symbol of everything I had accepted without question. Each payment represented trust given too freely, authority assumed by someone who never earned it, and silence maintained to avoid conflict. Understanding that shifted something fundamental inside me. It dismantled the idea that security must always come from sacrifice and replaced it with the knowledge that ownership, in all its forms, requires awareness. Paying rent on a home I never knew was mine taught me a lesson that extended far beyond property. It exposed how easily people can be conditioned to carry burdens that were never theirs, and how important it is to question arrangements that demand constant giving without clarity. When the truth surfaced, it didn't just return a home to me, it returned agency, confidence, and the right to occupy my own life without permission.
Grief has a way of stripping life down to its rawest parts, leaving little room for logic or caution. When everything familiar disappears at once, trust often becomes a lifeline rather than a choice. In the aftermath of losing my parents, the world felt unsteady and hollow, and I reached instinctively for the only person who shared that loss with me.
My sister's presence offered comfort in a moment when decision-making felt impossible, and I leaned on her guidance without hesitation, believing that shared grief meant shared honesty. During that fragile period, I was not thinking about long-term consequences or legal details. Survival came first, both emotionally and practically. I trusted my sister to handle matters I did not have the strength to examine myself, assuming her intentions mirrored my own need for stability. That trust was not earned through careful discussion or transparency. It was granted automatically because grief creates urgency, and family feels like the safest place to land. I believed we were protecting each other, not realizing that imbalance had already begun to take shape. Grief blurred my instincts. Questions that might have seemed obvious at any other time felt intrusive or unnecessary. I avoided asking about paperwork, ownership, or finances because it felt wrong to challenge someone who appeared to be helping me cope. In my mind, focusing on details seemed cold compared to preserving emotional closeness. That silence became the opening through which control quietly slipped from my hands into hers. Trust deepened the problem. I believed that love removed the need for verification, that loyalty meant accepting explanations without proof. When my sister presented decisions as already settled, I accepted them gratefully, relieved that someone else was carrying the mental load I could not manage. Each assumption I made strengthened her authority over situations that directly affected my future. Over time, those small concessions accumulated, creating a structure where she held information and power while I carried responsibility without understanding its source. The inheritance itself became invisible to me, not because it did not exist, but because it was deliberately kept out of sight. My sister's control did not arrive through force or confrontation. It came through reassurance, familiarity, and the repeated suggestion that I was not ready to handle such matters on my own. Framed as protection, her actions went unquestioned. I internalized the belief that my role was to endure, while hers was to manage. What made this dynamic particularly damaging was how naturally it blended with grief. Loss already diminishes confidence, making self-doubt feel justified. I questioned my own capacity instead of her intentions, assuming my exhaustion and confusion were signs that she knew better. Trust, once given, reinforced that belief. I mistook dependence for closeness and obedience for cooperation, allowing control to settle in without resistance. Only with distance did the truth become clear. Grief had created vulnerability, and trust had filled that vulnerability without safeguards. Together, they allowed my inheritance to be reshaped into something I was disconnected from entirely. The realization was painful not only because of what was taken, but because of how willingly I stepped aside, believing it was necessary for healing. Understanding this process reshaped my view of both grief and trust. Grief explains vulnerability, but it does not justify exploitation. Trust can comfort, but without transparency, it can also conceal harm. The experience taught me that protecting oneself during loss requires balance, not blind faith. Letting go of control in moments of pain should never mean surrendering one's future. What was taken under the guise of care revealed the importance of remaining present in one's own life, even when sorrow makes that presence difficult. That night unfolded with a weight that could be felt in every corner of the apartment, as if the walls themselves were listening. What began as an ordinary evening quickly transformed into something irreversible, a moment where words spoken could never be taken back. The familiar comfort of family, something I had clung to for years, cracked under the pressure of truths that had been hidden too long. It was the kind of night that divides life into before and after, leaving no room for denial once the truth finally surfaced.
The atmosphere shifted the instant the silence broke. Tension that had lived quietly beneath routine conversations suddenly demanded attention, rising to the surface with startling clarity. Every glance felt sharper, every pause heavier, as if everyone present understood that the fragile balance we had maintained was about to collapse. The truth did not arrive gently, it arrived with force, stripping away assumptions that had shaped how I saw my family and my place within it. As the reality unfolded, disbelief gave way to a deep, aching realization. The people I trusted most had not merely withheld information, they had allowed a version of reality to exist that served them while costing me years of sacrifice. The illusion of shared struggle dissolved, revealing a dynamic where responsibility and benefit had never been equal. What hurt most was not just the deception itself, but how normal it felt for so long. The truth exposed how easily familiarity can disguise exploitation when loyalty goes unquestioned. Emotions collided in waves that were impossible to control. Anger rose alongside grief, fueled by the understanding that the exhaustion I carried had not been inevitable. I had worked relentlessly under the belief that my effort was necessary to protect what little family I had left. That belief shattered as the truth revealed how misplaced my trust had been. In that moment, I felt the weight of every hour spent working instead of resting, every sacrifice justified by a story that was never fully mine. Family illusions do not break quietly, they shatter with sharp edges, cutting through long-held identities and expectations. The idea that family always acts in your best interest crumbled, replaced by the uncomfortable truth that closeness does not guarantee fairness. That night forced me to see that love, when paired with secrecy, can become a tool rather than a bond. The realization left me questioning not only my sister's actions, but my own willingness to accept imbalance as normal. The confrontation itself was raw and unfiltered. Voices rose, defenses collapsed, and excuses lost their power as facts took center stage. There was no space left for reinterpretation or justification. The truth stood exposed, demanding acknowledgement. In that exchange, the emotional distance that had quietly grown over years suddenly became visible, confirming what I had felt but never allowed myself to name. The family dynamic I believed in no longer existed in any recognizable form. Yet amid the devastation, clarity emerged. The night the truth came out was also the night self-deception ended. The illusions that shattered made room for something more grounded, a reality built on facts rather than hope. Painful as it was, the exposure created an opportunity to reclaim autonomy and redefine what family meant going forward. The truth did not heal the wounds instantly, but it stopped them from deepening. When the night finally ended, nothing felt the same. The apartment seemed quieter, heavier, as if absorbing the aftermath of everything that had been revealed. But within that silence was resolve. The illusions were gone, and with them the version of myself that accepted suffering as loyalty. That night marked the beginning of a different understanding, one where truth, however painful, became the foundation for a life no longer shaped by false narratives or misplaced trust.
Reclaiming my home was not just about property or paperwork. It was about restoring parts of myself that had been quietly eroded over years of exhaustion and misplaced loyalty. When the truth finally settled and the legal details aligned with what should have been clear from the beginning, the apartment transformed in my mind. It was no longer a place I fought to keep through constant sacrifice. It became a space that belonged to me without conditions, reflecting a sense of ownership that extended far beyond walls and doors. The process of taking control brought an unexpected mix of relief and grief. Relief came from knowing that the uncertainty was over, that I no longer had to justify my presence or earn the right to stay. Grief followed closely behind, mourning the years spent believing stability had to be bought with exhaustion. Each step toward reclaiming the space forced me to confront how much of my energy had been consumed by fear of loss, rather than appreciation of what I already had.
The realization was sobering, but it also carried the promise of change. As the apartment became fully mine, the shift was immediate and tangible. Changing the locks felt symbolic, a quiet declaration that boundaries now existed where none had before. Rearranging furniture, adding light, and choosing small details according to my own taste created a sense of agency I had not felt in years. These actions were simple, yet deeply affirming. They marked the transition from survival to intention, from endurance to comfort. The home began to reflect not compromise, but choice. Reclaiming power required more than legal resolution. It demanded confronting the belief that I was responsible for carrying everyone else's weight. Letting go of that mindset was difficult, especially after years of equating self-worth with sacrifice. Power, I learned, does not come from enduring injustice quietly. It comes from recognizing when trust has been broken and refusing to continue under terms that cause harm. Speaking up, setting boundaries, and enforcing them were acts of self-respect that reshaped how I viewed my own strength. Peace arrived slowly, not as a dramatic moment, but as a series of quiet changes. For the first time in years, my days were not defined by constant urgency. I no longer measured time in shifts worked or bills due. Even rest felt different, no longer shadowed by guilt or anxiety. The silence in my home became soothing rather than heavy, offering space to think, breathe, and heal. That peace was hard-earned, and I learned to protect it without apology. Distance played a necessary role in this transformation. Stepping away from relationships that thrived on imbalance allowed clarity to settle. Without constant emotional strain, I could reflect on what healthy connections truly require. Mutual respect, honesty, and accountability replaced obligation as the foundation for relationships I chose to maintain. This shift reinforced that peace is not something given by others, it is something built through conscious decisions. Reclaiming my home, my power, and my peace ultimately reshaped my future. The experience taught me that ownership extends to voice, time, and emotional well-being. What began as a painful awakening ended as a reaffirmation of self-worth. I no longer see strength as the ability to endure endlessly, but as the courage to choose myself. In doing so, I created a life grounded in stability, clarity, and peace, free from the quiet sacrifices that once defined my existence.